Welcome to The Road. This is a weekly podcast of All Saints Lutheran Church. I'm your host, John Pedersen, and I serve as pastor. Each week, we reflect on faith, life, and navigating the road ahead. The language of journey is common when we think about life. It has its joys and challenges along the way, and we all need a little encouragement and guidance at times to keep us going. There's a word in the Bible, asphalia, which means truth, but it's the same root word we use in English for asphalt, if you can believe that. It's a solid surface that makes travel easier and more assured. And so every week we're going to be exploring elements of faith and life that keep us on the road. Faith isn't about living a perfect life. It's about finding our way, getting through rough spots, but seeking out those great vistas too. You can find my weekly message here, but you'll also find special conversations with guests who have insights on things like wellness, parenting, and living with unique purpose. If you appreciate this podcast, remember to subscribe where possible and share it with a friend. Here's this week's message. When it comes to faith and experiencing God, does it feel like sometimes you're on the outside looking in? Curious perhaps, drawn to God in some way, but it feels mostly like you're an observer? Or do you feel like you're part of something, that you're in a relationship with Jesus and part of the community that Jesus started? Do you have a sense that Jesus is with you through it all, whether you're faced with struggle or joy? My hope for today is that you can walk away feeling like you are a part of this community and the larger movement that Jesus started, and that you feel accompanied by Jesus yourself. If you sometimes feel like you're just part of the crowd, then perhaps today's story from Luke will be inspiring for you. When we hear stories about the disciples, it might be easy to see ourselves as quite distant from their experience. I mean, it makes sense. They lived a long time ago. The 12 disciples that Jesus spent so much time with were given such a unique opportunity. And in the same way, we might look at celebrities or world leaders today and admire them and be able to relate in certain ways, but in the end, they may as well live in a different universe from us because their life and experience is so different from ours. Now, I actually don't see the 12 disciples that way personally, because their flaws and doubts and they're just so often on display throughout the stories of the Gospels. They seem very human to me. But even so, I can see how people perceive them or might perceive them as removed from their own experience. But there was another group of disciples beyond the 12. We hear about this group in a few places in the Gospels. They're mentioned almost more in passing. They're referred to as the 70. Jesus spends a great deal of time with the 12, but the 70 represent a larger circle of disciples that also followed Jesus. The story I read a few minutes ago about the two disciples on the road to Emmaus in some ways provides one of the greatest tributes to those 70. We know from the details that they are not part of the 11 disciples now without Judas, because they later run back to Jerusalem to find the 11. And yet they're specifically identified as his disciples. We only know one of their names, and that they were from Emmaus, which is outside of Jerusalem, not from Galilee like many of the 12. We can tell from their description of events that they've been in conversation with the 11 and the women, but they seem to be missing some details because they left Jerusalem too soon, it seems. The walk to Emmaus was at least several miles from Jerusalem, as we hear, far enough away for a long conversation. These two disciples were discussing what had happened over the last few days. Jesus had been crucified on Friday, and the day of their walk home was Sunday, Easter, the day of his resurrection. And on the road, they're accompanied by Jesus, but they're unable to recognize him. He asks them what they're discussing, and they begin to tell him. And what's the story they tell? The one they tell is a sad story, a disappointing one, a confusing one. One of them, Cleopas, replied, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that have taken place there in these days. And in their summary of the past 3 days, they say this: we had hoped he was the Messiah who had come to rescue Israel. These two disciples have not heard of anyone seeing the risen Jesus himself yet. They've heard he might be alive, but the story they tell is that the disciples went to the empty tomb after hearing the story of the women on Easter morning, and they don't see Jesus. They left with the initial reaction of the 11 disciples when they hear the report from the women on Easter morning that their words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. They're alone on the road with their disappointments before Jesus comes along. They're confused. What they're missing is the bigger picture. A larger story, more of the story, God's story. And that's what Jesus shares. Beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. All of the disciples of Jesus had assumptions about what kind of Messiah Jesus would be and how events would unfold, and Jesus shook up their assumptions. It doesn't matter who you are or how far along you think you are in faith. You need to be prepared to have Jesus widen your perspective. You need to be ready to awaken to a new vision of what God is up to. And these two disciples find his teaching and presence with them so compelling that they invite him to stay with them at their home for the night because it's getting dark and he appears to be continuing on beyond Emmaus. And it's when he was at the table with them and he took bread and blessed it and broke it and gave it to them that their eyes were opened, it says, and they recognized him, and then he vanishes from their sight. If Jesus were accompanying you along the way somehow, would you be able to recognize him? Sometimes we end up looking for God's presence and encouragement in very specific, and it turns out limiting ways. Even on the day of Easter, he apparently appeared to 2 of the 70, as we heard, in a way that they did not immediately recognize. They were not part of the 12, the inner circle. They were on the periphery, but Jesus still cared about them too. If you find it hard to fully identify with the 12 disciples at times, can you identify with the 70? Can you see yourself as part of the 70? Sometimes God shows up and extends peace and encouragement to us through the people around us. And the reality is that those people around you are all gifted in different ways. Sometimes we find wonderful conversation partners that are great listeners and provide encouragement. It might be in an ongoing friendship, or we might experience that in a more passing connection, or even through a professional counselor. Others come to us as mentors or teachers who help us think and learn and understand faith and our lives and the world better. Some might be coaches or advisors of some kind who challenge us and push us out of our comfort zone. Some might be visionaries who shed light on new pathways but may not be able to help you get every step of the way there. Perhaps some show up along the way to heal your wounds in the pattern of the Good Samaritan. If God is present with us in one of these or another way, but we're busy expecting a very specific kind of thing or person, we might be left unsatisfied. And so how are you expecting to be accompanied? If you've been positively impacted by someone in the past who had unique gifts, you might get caught looking for that same kind of person over and over because that's what you know. But if our expectations are too narrow, we might miss the abundance of what God is offering us every day. And the person who's right there with us, by our side. That's what happened, in a sense, to these two disciples. They were expecting Jesus in the way they had known him before, but he was coming to them in a new way now. And then they finally recognize him in the meal. The meal reminds them of the spirit and character of Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, served selflessly, sacrificed, and he taught his disciples to love one another as he loved them. There is peace in knowing that we're not alone, that we are accompanied by others. It doesn't have to be just one person or even one type of person. If we stay open and receive the peace offered to us in faith and listen to God's story unfolding in our midst, we may be able to see Jesus accompanying us in unexpected ways and through unexpected people. And if we come to experience Jesus in our midst, then maybe our hearts will burn within us too. We'll be inspired and led to share that spirit, not just in words, but through our own actions, using our unique gifts to bring life into this community and the world, to accompany others as we have been accompanied. In today's story, and in the music and the gathering of this community, may you go on your way feeling like you are a part of something special, part of the movement Jesus started, and that Jesus is among us and with you. Amen. That's this week's message. You don't have to navigate the road ahead alone. You can join with others at All Saints. Visit allsaintsmtka.org for more information. Have a great week.